So as consumer culture becomes dominated by brands, there actually became an increasing politics about and towards brand, particularly from the mid to late 90s and through to the kind of late 2000 and just before 2010 kind of period in particular. This was a kind of real dominant form of public politics. So increasingly, if we want to focus moving from the poetics to the politics of brands, there's been a kind of rise in, I think, awareness around the problematic nature of the production of a lot of our consumer products. And this is particularly the case around environmental issues, around the kind of use of chemicals in the relations to cancer, the use of air miles to kind of as a way of measuring the kind of absurd nature of the ways that things travel around the world, that we'll go into later in the course as well. Certainly the exploitation, of the way that our products are particularly mined or farmed in the developing world, and there's been some really great sociological and investigative journalistic studies around, the mining of coltan, the farming of coffee and farming of cocoa and things like that. There's the increasing rise of what's called temporary export zones, where there's a removal of any labour force laws. And then there's kind of the problems with energy and climate change around peak oil and stuff like that. So this stuff is kind of endless when we think about it. Everything's very connected, and much of the way that we consume, in the kind of West or the European, American, Australian world is inherently wasteful and incredibly damaging. So it's difficult to know wherever to start with this stuff. So in the third part today, I'll talk a little bit about Naomi Klein's work on No Logo that goes through some of this stuff, piece by piece. And then I'm doing a kind of a week on waste and cluttering and stuff later in the course. I think a really good example to think about the complete disconnect now between the symbolism and the materiality of consumer culture is that there was one year in the late 90s where Nike allegedly paid Michael Jordan more as a representative of the company to be performing in ads and stuff like that than the whole cost of making the shoes in 1 year in Southeast Asia. So you can see how here the shiny face seems to be much more important in terms of the ethical production of the shoes themselves. Now the book touches upon what I think is a really interesting sociological example of the politics of consumer culture here, and talks about the kind of move from commodity fetishism to what's become called commodity racism. And this relates to what's sometimes today called hipster racism in particular. This relates to the relationships within consumer culture, and particularly through branding and advertising, between the white fetishization of blackness, particularly around notions of coolness, and the black fetishization of white wealth and taste. And again, it's really, I think Bourdieu is quite useful to think about these kind of taste relationships here. So the kind of racial political issues discusses in this realm the kind of way that black culture, particularly African American black culture, is used to sell notions of cool to white people. And there's a juxtaposition going on here between buying into these cultures or just exploiting them. Particularly, brands like American Apparel and others have been kind of, Tommy Hilfiger in particular, have been accused of kind of exploiting African American culture to try and sell their clothing towards, the white middle class market in particular. So there's this juxtaposition between whiteness, between these notions of kind of taste and wealth and purity, and blackness, edgy, cool, hip style. And you can see these in notions of the use of jazz and hip hop in particular, the kind of horrible racial politics around games like Grand Theft Auto, and kind of branding's connotations with slavery in particular, and particularly the way the brands themselves are being used for tattoos and stuff like that. So it's often kind of argued here that cool, edgy African American culture is a kind of used as a form of effective or material labour to sell stuff to wider audiences and to wider markets. What's also interesting here, if you're interested in stuff, look at Thomas Frank's earlier work on what he called the co-optation of cool. This is particularly the way that many of the 1960s rock and roll and hippie generations turn into kind of yuppies and particularly successful capitalists throughout the 80s in particular. So I've got some links here to kind of have a look at this, some particularly contemporary notions of this, particularly around notions of hipster racism that often relate to notions of gentrification in particular. So if you're interested in this stuff, please have a look at those links now.